I never thought I'd be the kind of man who checks his wife's phone. In 63 years on this earth, I've done things I'm not proud of, made bad business calls, said the wrong thing at the wrong moment, let stubbornness get in the way of common sense more times than I'd care to admit. But I always believed that if you couldn't trust the person sleeping next to you, you'd already lost something you could never get back. Turns out, I was right about that. I just had the timing wrong. My name's Noel Hargreaves. I'm 63 years old, and until about a year ago, I ran a small but solid civil engineering consultancy out of Newcastle, New South Wales. Built it from the ground up over 30 years, started as a sole operator working out of my garage. Eventually grew to 14 staff, and a reputation that got us invited to tender on projects up and down the Hunter Valley. Not glamorous work, but honest. The kind of work that leaves roads and drainage systems and retaining walls behind it. Something you can point to and say, that's still there, because I did it right. I met Tara when I was 31, and she was 26. She was working the front counter at a conveyancing firm where I'd gone to sort out paperwork on my first proper office space. She had dark hair cut short and the straightest back I'd ever seen on a person just sitting at a desk. There was something efficient about her that I found oddly attractive. She got through my paperwork in 40 minutes, corrected 2 errors I'd made on the forms without making me feel stupid about it, and sent me off with everything I needed. I came back the following week with an excuse about a missing document I'd actually just forgotten to ask about the first time. She knew. She helped me anyway. We were married at 33 and 28. Modest ceremony at a garden venue down the road from her parents' place in Maitland. Her father shook my hand so hard I thought he was testing the structural integrity of my wrist. We honeymooned in Queenstown and came home to a 3-bedroom house in Wallsend and a mortgage that kept us both working harder than we probably should have. Lachlan came 2 years later. A big kid, red-faced and opinionated from the moment he arrived. He's 29 now and working in mine site logistics up near Muswellbrook. After him came Penny, now 26, who lives in Brisbane with her partner Josh and has her mother's straight back and her father's stubbornness in roughly equal measure. They're good kids, grown into good people. That part I got right. Even if other parts went sideways. For most of our marriage, Tara and I worked. Not in some Hollywood sense. We didn't sweep each other off our feet or write love letters. We were practical people who respected each other and showed up. She went back to work when Penny started school, eventually building her own career as an office manager at a mid-sized financial planning firm called Carrington Wealth. Over the years, she worked her way up until she was essentially running the place, hiring, compliance, scheduling, managing the principals. She was good at it. I told her that regularly, because it was true, and because I thought people deserved to hear it when they were doing something well. The first sign that something had shifted came about 2 years ago. Tara had always been a phone-down-at-dinner sort of person. She had firm ideas about that when the kids were young, and those habits stuck. So when I noticed her checking her phone under the table one evening while we were eating, I noted it but didn't say anything. People change small habits. It happens. But the small habits kept changing. She started taking her phone into the bathroom at night. She'd step outside to the back deck when certain calls came in, speaking in a lower voice than usual. When I'd come in from the shed or down from the home office, there'd be this brief adjustment screen tilted, phone turned face down, posture shifting in a way that was almost imperceptible but wasn't quite. The name that started appearing was Craig Dutton, one of the financial planners at Carrington Wealth. According to Tara, he was sharp, good with clients, and struggling a bit with some of the compliance changes the industry had been going through. She'd mentioned him the way you mention a colleague in passing, contextually, never in a way that invited follow-up questions. But he started coming up more. Craig thought they should renegotiate the software contract. Craig had a good idea about restructuring client meetings. Craig stayed late to help sort out an audit discrepancy. I noticed, but I noticed quietly. The way a man my age has learned to notice things. You stop reacting to every instinct and start watching instead. About 14 months ago, Tara was accepted into a professional development program through the Financial Planning Association, a series of workshops spread over 6 months, held monthly in Sydney. Overnight stays, occasionally 2 nights if the sessions ran long. I thought nothing of it. She'd been in the industry 20 years. This kind of thing was appropriate, even overdue. What I didn't register at the time was that Craig Dutton had apparently enrolled in the same program. The night everything cracked open started the way unremarkable evenings often do. Tara was at the Wednesday dinner with some colleagues after their office quarterly review. She'd told me not to wait up. I'd been in the shed since about 7. Finishing a set of shelves I'd been meaning to build for months, and I came inside around 9:30 to find her bag on the kitchen bench and her coat on the hook, which meant she was home earlier than expected. She was in the lounge, on her phone. She didn't hear me come in through the laundry, and what I heard, in the few seconds before she registered my presence, was her voice in a register I hadn't heard in a long time. Low, warm, the kind of voice you use when you're talking to someone who makes you feel something you don't want anyone else to see. She heard me then. The call ended within about 4 seconds, not a natural conclusion, just gone. She looked at me with an expression that tried to be neutral, but landed somewhere closer to caught. Work stuff, she said. Client crisis. Sorry. I didn't want to bore you with it, I said, right, and went to make a cup of tea. And while the kettle boiled, I made a decision I'd never made in 30 years of marriage. I was going to find out what was actually going on. I didn't check her phone that night. I waited. I'm not the sort to do things in a rush when a clear head will serve better. Over the next week, I paid attention. I watched her face when his name came up at home. I noticed when texts came through late at night that she'd read, then set the phone aside without responding, waiting until she was out of the room to reply. I noticed she'd started wearing earrings to work again, which she'd largely stopped doing years ago on account of finding them irritating by the end of the day. 8 days after the evening in the lounge, Tara left for a Saturday morning walk earlier than usual. She'd mentioned it the night before. She wanted to get out before the heat set in. She left her phone on charge in the kitchen. I stood there for a full minute, holding my coffee, looking at that phone. Then I picked it up. Her passcode was Penny's birthday. It always had been. I'd never had occasion to use it before. The messages from Craig went back 11 months. 11 months of a parallel conversation. Familiar. Affectionate. Sometimes tender in the way people are tender when they think no one else can see. There were references to the Sydney workshops, to hotels, to meals they'd had together. There were messages where he said things to her that I recognized as things she used to say to me early on, when we were still learning each other. There was a message from 3 weeks ago that I read twice, slowly, in which Craig talked about timing, about waiting until the right moment, about what things might look like once certain things were sorted. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that. Not because I think men shouldn't, but because I know myself well enough to know that when I'm hurt badly, I go very quiet. I go the kind of quiet that's actually quite loud on the inside, where everything slows down and gets precise. I took photos of the relevant messages on my own phone. I put her phone back exactly where it had been. I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink and went back out to the shed. By the time Tara came home from her walk, flushed and cheerful in her walking shoes, I'd made tea and was reading the paper at the kitchen table. I said, "Good walk?" She said, "Lovely." And we sat there, the two of us, in that ordinary kitchen, in that ordinary house, and the conversation we were having was not the one that mattered. I didn't confront her that day. I called my older brother Jeff that evening, who lives out at Cessnock on a small property where he runs a few cattle and fixes machinery. and has generally solved most of life's problems by thinking about them slowly. I drove out and sat on his back veranda, while the dogs lay at our feet and the paddocks went dark in the evening. I told him what I'd found. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the better things about Jeff. When I'd finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You know what you're going to do," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "I think so," I said. "Then do it properly," he said. "Don't get angry in the wrong direction. Get it done right." I called Helen Marsh on the Monday morning. Helen was a family law solicitor in Newcastle who'd been recommended to me a couple of years earlier by a business associate going through a difficult property dispute with an ex-partner. I hadn't thought I'd ever need her. I explained the situation clearly, and she told me to come in on Wednesday. Helen was measured and experienced, and didn't waste my time with sympathy I hadn't asked for. She asked practical questions. She told me what the process would likely look like, given that we'd been married 30 years and had shared property, shared finances, and a business I'd built in significant part during the marriage. She told me to document everything methodically and not to make any financial moves without advising her first. "Don't let emotion drive the timeline," she said. "Take the time you need to get everything in order before anything is served. If your wife doesn't know you know, that's an advantage. Use it calmly." I went home and sat with what I'd learned for another week. During that week, Tara and I cooked dinner together twice, watched television in the evenings, went to Lachlan and his partner Bree's place for Sunday lunch. I was present for all of it in the bodily sense. Something else in me had already begun to leave. Then I confronted her. It was a Tuesday evening. The dishes were done, the news was on low in the background. I turned the television off and sat down across from her and told her what I knew. I'll give Tara credit for one thing: she didn't try to tell me I was imagining it. She sat very still. Her hands were on the arm of the chair, and they didn't move. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Couple of weeks," I said. "The photographs go back further." She looked at the window. Something in her jaw was working. "I wasn't going to say anything for a while," she said. "I wanted to figure out what I wanted first." "That's a very interesting way to think about it," I said. "While you were figuring out what you wanted, what exactly did you think I was doing?" "You seemed fine," she said. "You always seem fine, Noel. That's part of the problem." I looked at her. 30 years I'd looked at that face. I knew every version of it. "Tell me about Craig," I said. She told me. Not everything, but enough. The connection had started at a conference, real enough at first. Apparently, a working relationship that got complicated during a difficult period for her at work. She said she'd felt unseen for a long time. She said I had a habit of being present in the room but not really there. She said she knew it wasn't right and had tried to step back twice, but hadn't managed it. I listened to all of it without interrupting, which was the hardest thing I've done in a long time. When she finished, I said, "I've been with a solicitor. I know where we stand, financially and legally. I don't want to have this conversation again. What I want to know is whether you believe this marriage is something you want to keep." She looked at her hands. "I don't know," she said. "That," I said, "is an answer." I moved into Jeff's spare room for 3 weeks. He left me alone mostly, which was the kindest thing anyone could have done. I worked from my laptop, kept my appointments, managed my staff as normally as I could. Tony, my project coordinator who'd been with me 12 years, knew something was wrong and had the good sense not to ask. Tara called several times in the first week. The calls were a mix of things: regret that felt real, and underneath it, a kind of negotiation. She mentioned the house. She mentioned what it would mean for her professionally if things became known. She mentioned once that Craig had apparently told her he wasn't in a position to leave his own marriage. I didn't say what I thought about that, which showed considerable restraint. Helen had told me to hold the paperwork until I was ready. I was ready at the start of week 4. The papers were served at the Carrington Wealth offices on a Thursday afternoon, which I'll admit was not entirely accidental. I'd thought about having them served at home, but there was something in me not malicious, I hope, but clear, that felt it was appropriate for the consequences to arrive where the choices had been made. Tara called me from the car park 40 minutes after the service. "You didn't have to do it like that," she said. "I know," I said. "I could have done it a lot of differently." "So could you." She didn't have a reply to that. The months that followed were not simple. 30 years of a shared life doesn't unwind cleanly. We'd co-owned the family home since 1998. We had joint savings, shared superannuation history, a whole financial architecture built across 3 decades. Helen was meticulous. Tara had her own solicitor, a man named Whitfield, who was competent and reasonable. And in the end, the process was adversarial, only in the ways it had to be. I kept the business. Tara received a larger share of the property settlement in lieu of any claim on the consultancy's goodwill value, which was the arrangement Helen had anticipated and structured toward. It was not a cheap outcome, but it was a clean one. The house was sold. I bought a smaller place, 3 bedrooms, quiet street in Adamstown, decent-sized garage for the shed work. It doesn't look like much from the outside. It suits me fine. Lachlan and Penny found out through a conversation I had with each of them separately. I was honest without being detailed. I told them their mother and I had grown apart in ways that couldn't be repaired, and that there had been a breakdown of trust on her side that I wasn't going to get specific about. Lachlan took it hard at first, which surprised me. He's always been the more pragmatic of the two. He came down from Muswellbrook the weekend after I told him, and we drove out to Jeff's and spent the day doing very little and talking about nothing much, which was exactly right. Penny was quieter. She asked me directly, in the way she does, whether I was going to be all right. "I'm 63, I said. "Not dead." "Yes." She made me promise to call her every Sunday. I have, without missing one. The one thing I wasn't prepared for was how Penny's reaction to her mother would unfold over the following months. Penny had always been the child who was closer to Tara in some ways. They had a shared directness, a shorthand. But something in the way things had unfolded, particularly once Penny had pieced together more of the picture than I'd given her, changed their dynamic in ways that I didn't cause and couldn't resolve for either of them. That's between them. I've made a point of not speaking poorly of Tara to the kids. What happened between us was between us. They're allowed to form their own conclusions, and they have. Craig Dutton, for what it's worth, left Carrington Wealth about 4 months after the divorce was initiated. I heard through a mutual industry contact that he'd been managing a similar situation with his own marriage at home, which did not resolve tidily. I have no particular feeling about Craig. He's a man who made choices and is living with them. That's the deal, for all of us. I retired from the consultancy properly about 6 months ago. I'd been planning it anyway, had a good project manager named Susan Yee, who I'd been mentoring for the better part of 3 years with exactly that transition in mind. I stayed on in an advisory capacity through the handover, and by October, she was running it without needing me. Good thing too. She's sharper than I was, at 40. These days I keep busy in ways that feel like choices rather than obligations. I've started building furniture properly, not the rough-and-ready shed work I'd done for years, but actual joinery, with decent timber and the patience to do it slowly. I've taken on a role as a technical reviewer for a regional engineering industry body, which gets me out twice a month without the burden of a full schedule. I go fishing with Jeff most Saturday mornings, which is largely just an excuse to sit in a boat without having to explain yourself to anyone. I'm not lonely. I want to be clear about that, because I know it might seem like the expected ending to a story like this. The man who got it wrong. Sitting alone, making furniture in his garage. That's not what this is. I have my kids, my brother, good mates, and a life that belongs entirely to me in a way that I'd stopped noticing it didn't. Somewhere in the middle of all those years, do I think about what I would have done differently? Of course. There are things I'd change, ways I could have been more present. Conversations I let slide because I thought silence was less trouble than engagement. Habits of self-sufficiency that probably read to someone standing across from them like distance. I own those things. They're real. But I also know this. Loyalty matters. Honesty matters. The choice to look a person in the eye and tell them the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient, that matters more than almost anything else in a shared life. When you start managing what someone knows instead of talking to them, you've already left. The physical departure is just paperwork. If there's anything worth taking from what I went through, it's this. Pay attention to the small things, because they're almost never small. Pay attention when something shifts in the person beside you, not with suspicion, but with the care you'd apply to anything worth keeping. And if you find yourself feeling unseen in your own marriage, say so out loud to the person you married before you go looking for that feeling somewhere else. That conversation, however difficult, is the honest one. Everything else is just damage you're postponing. I'm 63. The days are quieter than they used to be, and I've made my peace with that. Most mornings I have the shed to myself, a decent cup of tea, and whatever piece of timber I'm working on that week. Some evenings I drive over to Lachlan and Breeze for dinner and come home feeling better than when I left. On Sundays I call Penny and she tells me about Brisbane and her work and the small details of a life I'm glad she's building. It's not the life I thought I'd have at this point, but it's mine. And I know exactly what it cost. That's not a small thing. That might actually be everything. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not brooding. I want to be clear about that. More like the way you turn a piece of timber over in your hands before you start working it, just to understand what you're actually dealing with. The thing I keep coming back to is this. Nothing about Tara's choices happened in a vacuum, and neither did mine. We built something together over 30 years, and somewhere in the middle of it, we both stopped tending to it the way we should have. I got quieter when I should have spoken. She started looking elsewhere when she should have turned toward me. Those are two different kinds of failure. And I own my share of it, honestly. But there's a line between letting a marriage go quiet and choosing to deceive the person you made promises to. That line matters. How we treat it says everything about who we are. What I've come to understand is that the consequences Tara faced, the served papers, the professional fallout, Craig going back to his own life, the changed relationships with our kids, none of that was punishment handed down from somewhere. It was just the natural weight of the choices she made, finally arriving. That's how it works. You can manage what another person knows for a while. You can keep two stories running side by side, but the gap between them closes eventually, and when it does, everything you've been carrying lands at once. I didn't engineer her consequences. I just stopped absorbing them on her behalf. For me, the harder work was the internal kind. Walking away from a 30-year marriage at 63 isn't a clean thing. There's grief in it, even when you know it's right grief, for the version of things you thought you had, for the years that went into building something that didn't hold. I let myself feel that. I didn't rush past it or dress it up as liberation. It was loss, and it deserved to be called that. But I also made a decision fairly early on that whatever came next was going to be built on clear ground. No bitterness carried forward. No years spent relitigating what Tara did or didn't do. The intelligence in that isn't about being noble, it's practical. Bitterness is just borrowed suffering. You pay for it with your own time, and you don't get that time back. What I'd say to anyone sitting in something similar is this. The moment you know something is broken, the most dignified thing you can do is deal with it honestly. Get proper advice, legal, financial, practical. Don't act out of anger, but don't stay passive out of fear either. Jeff told me on his back veranda, do it properly. That was the best counsel anyone gave me through the whole thing. Not fast, not explosive, not vindictive. Properly. With your head clear, and your documentation in order, and your self-respect still intact. And take care of your kids, whatever their age. Lachlan and Penny were adults when this happened, but they still needed to know the truth. Told calmly, without either parent using them as a vehicle for their own hurt. That's a form of integrity too. It's quieter than dramatic gestures, but it's what holds. I'm on the other side of it now. Not unscathed, that would be too simple a word. But standing upright, doing work I'm proud of, with people I love around me. That's not a small outcome. That's what you can build when you refuse to let someone else's dishonesty become the defining thing about your life.